Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the car moved along the narrow, winding road that cut through the dense forest. It was nearly midnight, and the only source of light was the glow of the headlights reflecting off the pavement, illuminating the towering trees on either side. Emily leaned against the passenger seat window, scrolling mindlessly through her phone, the faint blue glow casting soft shadows on her face. The night was unusually silent, with no sign of other cars or even the distant hum of insects. It felt as if they were the only two people left in the world. Then, suddenly, a sound, faint at first, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. Emily's head snapped up, her brow furrowing as she lowered her phone and turned down the volume on the car's radio. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake frowned, his eyes still focused on the road. "Hear what?" Emily listened intently, her pulse quickening. Then, there was again, clearer this time, a baby crying. The sound was distant, almost muffled, but unmistakable. It sent an involuntary chill down her spine. She turned to Jake, eyes wide with concern. "Stop the car," she said urgently. Jake hesitated. It's probably just an animal," he reasoned, though his voice carried a note of doubt. "You know how foxes or some birds can sound like." "It's not an animal," Emily interrupted. "That was a baby, a real baby." Jake exhaled sharply, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, Emily's heart pounded. She knew what she had heard. She reached for the door handle. "Jake, we have to check." Jake muttered something under his breath, but pulled over, the car's tires crunching against a gravel shoulder. The moment the engine stopped, the silence of the night pressed against him like an invisible weight. Then, cutting through the stillness, came the cry again. Louder, clearer. Emily shivered. "It's coming from the woods." Jake sighed, rubbing his temple. "This is a bad idea," he muttered, but Emily was already stepping out of the car. A gust of cold wind brushed against her skin as she strained to listen. The crying continued, irregular and desperate, as if the child was lost or in pain. Jake finally relented, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepping out. 10 minutes, he warned. "If we don't see anything by then, we're leaving." Emily nodded quickly, already stepping toward the edge of the woods. The trees loomed tall, their gnarled branches forming twisted silhouettes against the dark sky. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her sneakers crunching against the fallen leaves. Jake followed close behind, sweeping the flashlight across the forest floor. The beam illuminated patches of damp earth, tangled roots, and occasional glimmers of reflective eyes belonging to unseen creatures. As they moved deeper, the crying grew louder. It wasn't a continuous wail. It came in short bursts, as if the baby was gasping for air between sobs. Emily's stomach clenched. "We're getting closer," she whispered. Jake scanned the trees, his jaw tightening. "Something's not right," he murmured. Emily shot him a glance. "What do you mean?" Jake shook his head. "If there was really a baby out here, why aren't we seeing any signs? No blankets, no bag, nothing." Emily swallowed hard, tried to push away the creeping unease clawing at the back of her mind. The crying seemed to be coming from ahead, beyond a dense cluster of trees. She pushed forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. As they reached the clearing, the sound suddenly stopped. Emily froze. The silence was deafening. Then, in the faint glow of Jake's flashlight, something appeared just a few feet ahead. Sitting alone in the middle of the clearing was a baby stroller. Emily's breath hitched. The stroller was slightly tilted, its wheels partially sunken into the damp ground. It looked old, worn fabric, faded colors, and patches of dirt clinging to the frame. There was no baby inside. Jake took a cautious step forward, his flashlight beamed steady on the empty stroller. "Emily," he started, his voice low. Emily felt her knees weaken. The air around them suddenly felt heavier, charged with something unexplainable. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, the crying started again. Only this time, it was coming from behind them. Emily's breath hitched as the wailing started up again, this time echoing from somewhere behind them. The sound was still distant but sharper, more deliberate, almost as if someone or something was moving around. Her body tensed, and she instinctively reached for Jake's arm. "That's not possible," she whispered. "We just came from there." Jake's face was pale under the flashlight's glow. His grip tightened around the handle. "We need to go back to the car. Right now." But Emily hesitated. Everything in her screamed to run. But what if this really was a baby and needed help? What if someone had left it out here on purpose? She took a slow step toward the stroller, her eyes scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of life. "What if someone's playing a sick joke?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Or worse, what if someone abandoned a child out here?" Jake exhaled sharply. "Emily, listen to me. Something's wrong. The sound isn't coming from one place. It's moving, and that means it's not natural." Emily turned toward him, about to argue, when something snapped loudly in the darkness beyond the clearing. Both of them froze. The flashlight flickered slightly as Jake swung the beam toward the sound, but it caught only dense trees, their bark twisted and damp. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the crying stopped again. The silence was suffocating. Emily's heartbeat pounded in her ears as she took another step closer to the stroller. The old fabric looked worn, but there was something else, something off. She squinted, her fingers lightly touching the handle. And that's when she saw it, a dark stain along the side, smeared as if someone had grabbed the frame with muddy or bloody hands. A chill ran down her spine. Jake must have seen it too, because his posture stiffened. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice tense. "Step away. Now." Emily turned to him, her pulse racing. But before she could respond, a rustling sound came from behind them again. Jake swung the flashlight back, his hands shaking now. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed closer, their dark forms pressing inward. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. The forest had felt vast when they first entered, but now it felt as if it were closing in on them. Jake reached for her hand, his grip firm. "We are leaving. Right now." Emily nodded stiffly, her breath unsteady, and turned with him. They took only a few steps before the crying started again, but this time it was right beside them. Emily's stomach twisted in terror as she whipped her head toward the sound. But there was nothing. No baby. No movement. Just sound. Jake's flashlight sputtered, the beam dimming. "Damn it," he muttered, smacking the side of it. The bulb flickered weakly, throwing jagged shadows across the trees. Emily's skin prickled with the overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. "We're being played with," she whispered, gripping Jake's arm. Another snap echoed through the trees, closer this time. Jake grabbed Emily's wrist and pulled her with him, his breath shallow. "Move. Now." Emily didn't argue. They turned, pushing through the undergrowth, heading back the way they came. But with every step, the ground beneath them seemed less familiar. The trees looked different, their trunks shifting into shapes Emily swore hadn't been there before. "We came from this way, right?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Jake didn't answer. His grip on her hand was painfully tight. He stopped abruptly, yanking her back. Emily nearly stumbled as he lifted the flashlight again, scanning their surroundings. Then they saw it, right in front of them. The stroller. Emily's stomach dropped. "No," she whispered. No, that's not possible." Jake's face was pale, his jaw clenched. "We went in a straight line. There's no way we should be back here." Emily's breathing came in short gasps now. Something was leading them in circles. Then the crying returned, louder than ever, this time from all around them. And in that moment, Emily understood. They were not alone in the woods. Emily felt her chest tighten as the sound of crying echoed from all directions. It was no longer coming from just one place. It was surrounding them, wrapping around the trees, filling the air with something unnatural. Her legs trembled as she turned in a slow, desperate circle, her breath shallow. "Jake," she whispered, gripping his arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jake's face was rigid with fear, his knuckles white around the flashlight. "I know," he muttered, scanning the trees with wild eyes. The beam flickered as he turned, casting warped shadows against the gnarled trunks. Everything looked wrong, distorted, Emily tried to retrace their steps in her mind. They had come from the east. She was sure of it, but now, standing in the same clearing with the stroller that should have been far behind them, she felt the weight of something much worse. They weren't just lost. They were being led. The crying stopped again. Emily held her breath. The silence felt heavy, unnatural, waiting for something. Then she heard it. Not crying, not rustling leaves. Breathing. Close. Too close. Her blood turned to ice. Her body stiffened as she realized the sound wasn't coming from Jake. It wasn't coming from her. It was coming from behind them. Jake must have heard it too because he grabbed her wrist and yanked her closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't. Turn. Around. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were planted, locked in place by the sheer terror of knowing that something, or someone, was standing right behind them. The flashlight flickered again. Emily clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. We have to go, she said, her voice shaking. We have to move, now. Jake took a deep breath and spun around first. Emily followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing, only trees, stretching into the darkness. But that didn't make sense. She had heard it, felt it. Jake tightened his jaw and pointed the flashlight toward the ground. That's when they saw them. Footprints, fresh, in the damp earth, right behind where they had just stood. Emily covered her mouth, muffling a gasp. The prints were deep, as if whoever, or whatever, had been standing there was watching them up close. Jake pulled her forward. We're leaving. Now. Emily didn't argue. She forced her legs to move, though every nerve in her body screamed at her to keep looking over her shoulder. Something had been standing there, and now it was gone. As they hurried forward, the trees around them seemed to shift. The ground felt uneven, the path they had walked before now completely unrecognizable. Emily's breath came in short gasps. This isn't right, she whispered. Jake didn't slow down. Just keep moving. Then, another sound. Not crying this time. Laughter. Soft. Low. Almost playful. Emily's stomach dropped. Jake stopped in his tracks. His grip on her wrist tightened so much that it hurt. Did you hear that? Emily's head was spinning. Tell me I imagined it. Jake didn't answer, because they had both heard it. Emily turned slowly, dread curling in her stomach. Her eyes darted between the trees, searching for whatever was out there. The laughter had stopped as quickly as it had come, leaving them in an eerie, suffocating silence once more. Then movement, a flicker of motion in the shadows, just beyond the tree line. Jake swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing. Emily took a shaky step forward, her pulse racing. Then she saw it, something hanging from a tree branch a few feet ahead. A stuffed toy. Emily felt her knees weaken. It was small, covered in dirt. It seemed frayed from time and weather. A baby stuffed animal. And then the crying returned. But this time, it wasn't from the trees. It was right beside them. Emily turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. The stroller. It was moving. The wheels shifted slightly, rocking forward an inch as if someone had just touched it. But no one was there. Emily grabbed Jake's arm with so much force that her nails dug into his skin. Jake, she choked out. His expression was pure terror. Emily could feel it now, the presence. Not just something watching them, something waiting. The flashlight flickered again. Then, in the brief flash of darkness, a figure stood at the edge of the clearing. Tall, motionless, watching. Emily screamed, and the light came back. But the figure was gone. Jake yanked her forward, his voice breaking with panic. Run. And they did. They ran like their lives depended on it. Because for the first time that night, Emily realized the truth. They weren't chasing the sound. Something had been leading them all along. Emily's legs burned as she sprinted through the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Jake was ahead of her, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he ran. The sound of their footsteps thundered against the silence of the forest, kicking up damp leaves and snapping twigs beneath them. But no matter how fast they ran, the feeling of being followed never faded. The crying had stopped again. and that somehow made everything worse. Emily tried to focus on the path ahead, but the ground felt unfamiliar, twisted, as if they were running deeper into the woods instead of out. "Jake," she cried, her voice strained. "Are we even going the right way?" Jake didn't slow down. "I don't know." His voice was tight, panicked. "I don't even know where we are anymore." Emily's stomach clenched. The realization hit her hard. They were lost. Jake suddenly skidded to a stop, nearly causing Emily to crash into him. He swung his flashlight to the left, then to the right. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, his breath coming fast. "We should have hit the road by now." Emily turned in circles, trying to find anything, that looked familiar, but the trees all looked the same, stretching endlessly in every direction. The flashlight beam flickered again, and for a split second, Emily thought she saw something move between the trees. She clutched Jake's sleeve. "We're not alone," she whispered. Jake barely had time to react before the laughter returned. Soft, playful, too close. Emily's entire body went cold. She grabbed Jake's arm, her fingers digging into his jacket. "Jake, tell me you heard that." Jake's expression was frozen in sheer terror. "I heard it." The flashlight flickered again, then the sound of footsteps. Not theirs. Something else. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The steps were light, slow, deliberate, moving around them. She whipped her head around, trying to pinpoint the direction, but it was impossible. Every time she thought she knew where it was coming from, it changed. Then a shadow moved, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's dim beam. Jake grabbed Emily's hand. "We keep moving. No stopping." Emily nodded quickly, swallowing her fear. They turned and ran again, this time with a desperate sense of urgency. The trees blurred past them as they weaved through the undergrowth, but no matter how fast they ran, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Then Emily saw something ahead, a shape, a structure, a cabin. She gasped, "Jake, there's a house." Jake saw it too. Relief flickered in his eyes. "Go!" They sprinted toward it, adrenaline pushing them forward. The cabin was old, its wooden walls covered in ivy, the windows dark. There was no sign of life, but at that moment, Emily didn't care. Anything was better than being out in the open. Jake reached the door first and shoved it open. The hinges groaned, and the smell of damp wood and dust hit them as they stumbled inside. Emily slammed the door shut behind them, her chest heaving. Silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, the forest outside was silent. Jake locked the door, pressing his back against it. "We just need a minute," he panted. "Just to think." Emily nodded, her hand shaking. She scanned the room, small, abandoned. Dust covered the floor. A broken chair lay in one corner. The only furniture still intact was a wooden table and an old dresser pushed against the wall. No sign of anyone living here. No indication of how long it had been empty, but something felt off. Then Emily's gaze landed on the crib in the corner of the room. Her stomach turned. Jake followed her gaze and stiffened. What the hell? The crib was old, its paint peeling, and sitting inside it, covered in dust and cobwebs, was a tiny, tattered baby blanket. Emily's breath came out in short gasps. Jake took a cautious step forward, shining his flashlight over the crib. That's where he noticed the writing on the wall. Faint, barely visible, scratched into the wooden planks above the crib in jagged letters. "Don't follow the crying." Emily stumbled backward. Jake stared at the words, his face pale. "We need to get out of here." Emily nodded quickly, her entire body trembling. But just as they turned toward the door, a loud thud came from outside. They both froze. Then another, and another. Heavy, slow, footsteps on the porch. Emily's blood ran cold. She grabbed Jake's arm so tightly that her nails dug into his skin. "Jake," she mouthed. Jake shut off the flashlight. Silence. The footsteps stopped. Emily didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then the doorknob turned. Once, twice, slowly, deliberate, and just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For several agonizing seconds, they waited, froze in place. Then, the crying returned, right outside the door. Emily covered her mouth to stop a scream. Jake reached for the lock, his hands shaking. "We have to run." Emily nodded. She could barely breathe. Jake threw the door open, and they ran, out into the night, away from the cabin, away from whatever had been waiting for them. Emily didn't dare look back, because she knew if she did, she would see it, and she didn't want to see it. Emily's lungs burned as she sprinted through the darkness, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. Jake ran beside her, his grip on her wrist like a lifeline, dragging her forward even as exhaustion clawed at them both. The forest blurred past, a never-ending wall of twisted trees and suffocating shadows. But Emily didn't care where they were going anymore. They just had to get away. The crying had stopped again, but the silence was worse. The footsteps, whoever or whatever had been outside the cabin, were gone now, but the overwhelming feeling of being watched hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown stronger. Jake suddenly skidded to a stop, nearly pulling Emily off balance. "What are you doing?" she gasped, her chest heaving. Jake spun in a frantic circle, shining his flashlight wildly around them. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, his voice thick with panic. "We should have hit the road by now." Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. He was right. They'd been running for too long. Panic surged through her. "Are we lost?" Jake didn't answer. His breathing was shallow, his flashlight beam flickering as he turned again. Then suddenly, the beam landed on something ahead. Emily's stomach dropped. It was the stroller, sitting directly in their path. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "No!" she whispered. Jake took a step back, his face pale. "That's not possible." Emily's vision swam. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst. They had run in a straight line. There was no way they should have ended up back here. Unless... Her hands trembled as she grabbed Jake's sleeve. "Jake," she whispered, "we're not lost." Jake turned to her, his expression filled with something worse than fear, realization. "We were led here," she finished, her voice barely audible. The flashlight flickered again. Emily clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. Then she saw it, just behind the stroller. The footprints, deep imprints in the damp earth, leading away from the stroller into the trees. But something was wrong about them. They weren't just one set of footprints. There were multiple, some small, some larger, and they were fresh. Emily's breath came in short gasps. Someone's been here. Jake took a shaky step forward, shining the flashlight over the ground. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "No," he said slowly. "They still are." Emily's blood turned to ice. Then, a rustling from the trees. Jake grabbed her arm and yanked her back just as something moved in the darkness. Emily's breath caught. The shadows shifted. Then she saw it, a figure standing between the trees. Tall, still, watching. Emily's entire body locked up. Her lungs refused to work. She couldn't see a face, only the outline. A dark silhouette standing motionless in the thick of the forest. Jake took a step back, pulling her with him. Then it moved. Not fast, not sudden, slow, deliberate, toward them. Emily's heart stopped. Jake didn't wait. He grabbed her wrist and ran. Emily's feet barely touched the ground as she followed, her mind screaming at her to move faster. She didn't dare look back. Then, the crying started again. But this time, it was right beside her. Emily's body seized. She turned her head, terror clawing at her throat. Nothing. Only Jake. But the crying hadn't stopped. It was still right there, running with them. Emily's body went cold. Then, all at once, the crying turned into laughter. Soft, mocking. Emily let out a choked sob. Jake. And then, headlights. Blinding. Sudden. The road. Emily didn't think. She ran straight for the light. A car screeched to a halt just feet away. Emily collapsed onto the pavement, her legs finally giving out. Jake dropped beside her, his breath ragged, his entire body shaking. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, a door slammed. Emily blinked up, her vision blurry. heart still hammering. A figure approached them, stepping into the glow of the headlights. A man wearing a uniform. The relief hit so hard that Emily nearly sobbed. It was a park ranger. The man stopped a few feet away, looking down at them with a furrowed brow. "Are you two all right?" Emily tried to speak, but nothing came out. Jake managed to nod, though his hands were still shaking. He swallowed thickly. "We were in the woods. We heard." The ranger's face changed. Emily froze. His expression wasn't confused. It was serious, dark, like he already knew what they were about to say. Emily's skin prickled. The ranger exhaled, glancing toward the trees. Then he looked back at them and said, "You need to leave, right now." Emily's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as she stared up at the ranger. His face, illuminated by the car's headlights, was unreadable. Calm, but tense, like a man who had seen this exact situation unfold before. The weight of his words lingered in the air. "You need to leave, right now." Jake swallowed hard, his body still trembling. "What?" His voice came out hoarse. "What the hell is going on?" The ranger's eyes flickered toward the tree line, his posture stiff. "Get in the car," he ordered. Emily hesitated, her pulse still hammering. We heard something in there," she stammered. "A baby crying. And then—" She stopped herself, shuddering. She didn't want to say it. The footsteps, the stroller, the laughter. The ranger's gaze sharpened. "You heard the baby?" Jake ran a shaking hand through his hair. "Yes," he muttered, over and over. It kept moving. And then he trailed off, glancing back at the trees, as if afraid something might be standing there again. The ranger exhaled slowly. "Get in the car," he repeated, but Jake wasn't ready to drop it. "You know something," he said, stepping forward. "You know what's out there." Emily grabbed his sleeve, her fingers still icy from fear. "Jake!" The ranger let out a long breath, then glanced at the trees one last time. His shoulders tensed, and when he spoke, his voice was low. "I've worked here for 15 years, he said. "And in that time, I've heard dozens of stories just like yours." Emily's heart skipped. The ranger nodded toward the woods. People passing through, hikers, campers, folks driving late at night like you too. They all hear the same thing. A baby crying in the woods. Jake frowned. "But how?" The ranger's face darkened. "Years ago, before this land was protected, there were reports of criminals in the area using the sound of a crying baby to lure people deeper into the forest." Emily stiffened. Jake's eyes widened. "Lure them?" The ranger gave a slow, grim nod. "People have a natural instinct to help a crying infant. It makes them drop their guard." And once they were deep enough in the trees, he let the sentence hang, his expression enough to make Emily's stomach twist. Jake's jaw tightened. "You're saying this was what? A trap?" The ranger's silence was answer enough. Emily's breath hitched. "But that was years ago, right? They caught them." The ranger's expression flickered with something unreadable. "Some of them," he admitted. "Not all." A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. Jake crossed his arms. "That doesn't explain what we saw tonight," he said. "The stroller, the footprints, He stopped himself, swallowing hard. "The thing in the woods." The ranger's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned slightly, looking at the forest as if it had ears. "The brain is a tricky thing," he said finally. "Fear and darkness can make it see things that aren't there." Emily wasn't convinced. The footprints had been real. The stroller had been real. And whatever had been watching them had been very real. Jake was shaking his head. "That's it? That's your answer? We imagined it." The ranger met his gaze. "I'm saying fear makes people vulnerable," he said. "And I'm saying that whatever used to happen in these woods," his voice dropped slightly, "might still be happening." Emily's stomach dropped. Jake's expression hardened. "You think someone is still out there?" The ranger didn't answer right away. He looked back at the trees, his fingers twitching slightly near his belt, where a holstered gun sat. Then he turned back to them. "I think it's time you go home," he said quietly. A thick silence settled between them. Jake finally nodded, his hands clenching into fists. "Come on," Emily muttered. Emily hesitated, glancing back at the woods one last time. For a split second, she thought she saw something. A flicker of movement between the trees. A shadow shifting, just beyond the reach of the headlights. Watching. Then nothing. Emily turned away. She didn't want to see it anymore. They climbed into the car, and Jake started the engine. The ranger stepped back, his face unreadable. "Drive safe," he said. Jake didn't respond. As they pulled away, Emily kept her eyes on the rearview mirror. The forest blurred into the distance, the road stretching out before them. The further they got, the lighter she felt. The grip of the woods seemed to loosen, the suffocating weight lifting from her chest. And yet, just before they turned the last bend, Emily swore she saw it. A stroller, sitting at the tree line, still, waiting. And then, just as they rounded the corner, the baby started crying again.